Good evening. My name is Jim Malley, and I'm pleased to be with you to discuss a very important, in my mind, a very important topic. But as with many things, I would like to begin with an arrival meditation. And so if you wish, I invite you to join us, or if you prefer, you can just sit quietly. We meditate to live fuller and richer lives and to bring compassion to ourselves and to the world. Meditation is always a personal choice. So if you prefer, you are most welcome to just sit quietly. I would like to invite you to sit up with your feet firmly planted on the floor and with a straight back. As you feel comfortable, I invite you to either close your eyes or soften and lower your gaze. Let's begin by taking 3 deep breaths. Notice each in-breath and each out-breath as your belly rises and falls. The word arrive comes from the root word meaning to reach the shore. Each moment is a new arrival. We land here in this moment of quiet, focus, and stillness. Nothing else matters. Not the chores left behind or the jobs yet to do. You have arrived in this place now. We bring our awareness to our breath, knowing that when we focus on our breath, we are focusing on the very life force. Therefore, to contemplate breathing is to contemplate life itself. Breathing in, I know that I am breathing in. Breathing out, I know that I am breathing out. You may wish to notice your internal speedometer. At what pace are you traveling now? What emotions or sensations are you experiencing? Just notice them with curiosity. Breathing in a sense of gratitude for this opportunity to be together. Breathing out, may we open our eyes to see the needs and sufferings of others, most especially the people of Ukraine. May we have the strength, understanding, compassion, and courage to use our talents to serve others, to build a more livable and loving world. Now let us just take 3 more breaths and then bring our awareness back to the room so we may continue. I'd like to begin by congratulating Rabbi Berman and the staff of the Charter Oak Cultural Center for the wonderful article on childhood trauma that was published in the April 17th issue of the Hartford Current, highlighting Charter Oak as an ACEs-aware organization that offers programs and practices to address the problems of childhood trauma. ACEs constitute another pandemic that has remained largely unaddressed by American society. Just a fraction of the resources expended to combat the coronavirus pandemic could help to prevent an enormous amount of human suffering that takes place every year in this form of serious emotional and physical disease that has its roots in childhood trauma. An organization called ACEs Too High has even suggested that Vladimir Putin, because he was brought up in extreme poverty and deprivation in post-World War Leningrad and was bullied by others, that what we're experiencing now is residuals from that early childhood experience. Similarly, Hitler and Stalin both suffered merciless beatings from their fathers and went on to be responsible for the deaths of millions of people. Charter Oak is making counseling available to both children and adults in its youth arts program and incorporates meditation and mindfulness-based yoga beginning at every class. These practices have been shown to help people reduce stress and better regulate their emotions. So again, a hearty congratulations to Charter Oak for the amazing work that they're doing. I've titled today's presentation, "The Seeds We Sow, the Brain-Based Approach to a Brighter Future." Truth be known, I was going to title this, "The Seeds We Sow, Perspectives on an Endangered Species." But my wife, who was much smarter than I am, said, "Are you crazy? People are depressed enough as it is. You have to give people hope." So I promised not to be all gloom and doom, but neither will we look through the world through rose-colored glasses. Truth be known, I believe that the brain-based approach that I am about to review with you is a very hopeful opportunity for creating a positive future. To begin with, I'd like to present a brief scene for you to think about. And I'm wondering if I might have a volunteer to read this for me.
I'll do that. A gardener lovingly tends to her multicolored flower bed, enjoying the fresh air and warmth of the sun on the back of her neck. Gardening was one of her favorite activities that imbued her with a sense of inner peace and the feeling that all was right with the world. But the moment of serenity was shattered by the sudden shock of a painful bee sting on the back of her hand. She snapped her hand away, jumped to her feet, and ran feverishly to her kitchen sink to pour cold water on her hand. Just one day later, doggedly fighting residuals of fear and hesitancy, she reluctantly returned to her garden, but this time with heightened anxiety and nervous hypervigilance of her surroundings.
Thank you. What the gardener likely did not know was that all of the feelings she experienced in her frightful gardening incident were complex neurological responses that occurred as an intricate dance between her brain and the environment. Neuro, because the varying emotions she experienced originated within the complex circuitry of her brain. Ecological, because her emotional responses were directly linked to the unique experiences of her changing physical world, the environment. There is, in effect, a perpetual feedback loop that occurs between our brains and the environments within which we are embedded. In just a short window of time, the gardener experienced 3 distinctly different emotions that were environmentally induced. First, a pleasurable feeling that she was basking in the beauty of nature. Then, shock and horror from the unexpected bee sting. And lastly, residual feelings of anticipatory anxiety and dread as she returned to the garden, fearing that she might be stung again. While initially enjoying the sublime pleasure of gardening on a gorgeous day, a tiny section in her midbrain was likely secreting a neurotransmitter called dopamine, known affectionately as the pleasure hormone, the same substance that is present when someone is enjoying a good meal, winning at the casino, having sex, or using drugs. Because she enjoyed gardening, her hypothalamus may have even produced a splash of oxytocin, the so-called love hormone, that is sometimes present when someone feels safe, happy, and in the presence of a loved one, or even that halcyon feeling of being one with nature. Then in a flash, the bee sting activated her brain's stress response system to prepare her body for fight or flight by releasing adrenaline, cortisol, and glucose so that she could flee from the scene of the vicious assault. A third brain reaction likely occurred when the woman prepared to return to her garden the next day, this time with residual memories of the previous day's frightful event. That she was unable to shake her uneasiness was likely due to her brain's threat protection system, her amygdala and hippocampus, that provide protective cover by retaining memories of traumatic events. In this presentation, we will examine that unique relationship that exists between we humans and our embodied brains, and the ways we are influenced, for better or for worse, by the multiple environments in which we live. Unlike other species on the planet, only Homo sapiens, the collective we of humanity, has been gifted with the agency to create the kinds of environments that shape our own brains, and thus the quality and nature of our very being. The word we is operative here. We are the ones that are creating the environments that will help us either thrive or flourish, or devolve and destruct. And unfortunately, the evidence is that we are moving in the direction of the latter rather than the former. In effect, there is a one-to-one relationship between the brain and the environment. We shape the environment, and the environment shapes our brain. In the beautiful book that we recently read with the help of Charter Oak, called Nurturing Our Humanity by Riane Eisler, she makes the point that the human brain enters the world as a work of progress. That really tells the whole story. The brain, the organ that is responsible for regulating human behavior, is continually being shaped by the environment in which a person lives. This theme about the brain environment connection came up over and over again in the wonderful discussion on nurturing our community, led by the wonderful doctoral student, Ponder Abra. Here are just a review of such instances where the brain environment connection is mentioned in Nurturing Our Humanity. Today, we know that cultural environments we create affect nothing less than how our brains develop, and hence how we think, feel, and act. Our consciousness, or lack thereof, is largely a function of our cultural contexts. Evidence from psychology and neuroscience tells us that children's early experiences and observations powerfully affect brain development. The neural patterns of our minds are greatly influenced by our environment, particularly in our early years. So what we are talking about is basically a neuroecological perspective. And this sort of summarizes what that's all about. Excuse me, I've just pushed. The brain is continually being shaped over the course of a person's life by the environments within which the person resides. The health and growth of the brain depends upon whether its human host dwells in favorable or unfavorable environments. A human society will thrive and flourish if its citizens live within healthy and life-giving environments that enable them to regulate their behaviors for the benefit of their communities. However, a society will falter and decline if its culture and institutions do not provide its citizens with life-enhancing environmental conditions that facilitate the healthy brain development of its members. These are the seeds that we sow. The phenomenon of neuroplasticity in humans was discovered only as recently as the 1990s and was so important that some regard it as another Copernican revolution. Experience-dependent neuroplasticity is sort of the operative formation that takes place within the brain's ability to recognize itself in response to one's experiences by performing new neural connections throughout life. I have a little video that I'd like to show you that gives you sort of a sense of how that operates. I'm having some technical problems.
The human brain is a profoundly complex organ. 90% of its activity occurs beneath conscious awareness, which means that even though we assume that we have some control of how we think, feel, and behave, modern science suggests it's not so simple. The concept of neuroplasticity is a new and exciting area of science. It highlights that our brain is constantly being reshaped throughout our lives by both our experiences and our thoughts. We now know that it is the focus of our awareness that determines which brain networks are strengthened and which are weakened or lost. That means that when we get caught up in cycles of worry or irritability, these are the networks within the brain that become stronger. So the more we worry, the better we become at worrying. However, on the other side of this, if we practice being calm, clear, and focused, we can strengthen these networks too. As humans, our brain differs from other animals. This is mostly due to the front areas of the brain called the frontal lobes, often called the new brain, as it was the last to develop in our evolution. When well developed, this part of our brain helps us to manage our strong emotions and respond with flexibility, even when we feel overwhelmed. It also helps us to tune into the feelings of others with empathy and insight. When we feel worried, distracted, or stuck on achieving goals, our brain function is more strongly dominated by our old brain, which has a part called the amygdala. The amygdala manages the powerful fight and flight response, which switches on when we feel stressed or anxious and releases hormones and chemicals such as cortisol and adrenaline. That is why stress has such a big impact on us. Mindfulness is a technique that can help us to manage this process more effectively by building our skills of attention, concentration, and a capacity to direct our awareness in a certain way. This all means that we're less likely to be swept up by a strong emotion and the power of the amygdala. It also means we can bring choice to our emotions and our thoughts. In doing so, we're playing an active role in changing the way the structure of our brain develops, in much the same way we can change the shape of our body by doing certain exercises at the gym. When we practice meditation regularly, we build a capacity to become aware of thinking and emotion. As our mind becomes more settled, our nervous system is able to take in more accurate information, and we can access capacities for creativity, flexibility, and lateral thinking, which enable us to manage challenging situations more skillfully. When we build skills of mindfulness, we still experience negative feelings like frustration, disappointment, fear, or irritability. But the research shows that we recover much more quickly. We now know from research into brain development that regular meditation and mindfulness practice reduces the size of the amygdala, reduces levels of stress hormones, and strengthens connections to the frontal lobes. This all means that we're more likely to live with less stress and more happiness.
So I was very pleased to hear that Charok has been using mindfulness and meditation as just one remedy to address stress and trauma. As the video showed, research has shown that mindfulness increases neurogenesis. It increases
Harvard conducted a research study, and they tracked more than 1,000 people from birth until age 32, looking for what made someone successful. What common characteristic or trait was seen in a successful individual?
I'm sorry,
It wasn't their
there's a little bit of a
race,
technical
what
problem here.
language
We
they
have to see if
spoke,
we can straighten
what
this out.
neighborhood they grew up in, or how much money their parents had. It wasn't.
So it is this concept of neuroplasticity that, according to the wonderful author Barbara Marx Hubbard, said it gives us into our hands, has been given to us the power of co-destruction or co-creation. The future of humankind depends wholeheartedly on humanity's ability to create the kinds of environments that promote human health and expand human consciousness. And this is known as conscious evolution. Let's take a brief look at our brains. Our brains are responsible for everything that we do and everything that we are. The autonomic system actually keeps us alive. Without the autonomic system, we would not be able to breathe or have a heartbeat. The sensory system helps us to know about the world. It provides us the ability to see, to hear, to taste, smell, and feel, to know about the world. Without our language system, without our motor system, we wouldn't be able to move, to crawl, or to walk, or to run. Without the language system, we would not be able to communicate with one another at all. And lastly, without the limbic system, which is the lower part of the brain, we would not be able to engage with the world or have a sense of that beautiful emotional texture. So in the beginning, just 5 weeks after conception, neurons, the fundamental components of the brain, begin growing at the rate of 250,000 cells, or so-called neurons, per minute, and migrating to form different structures of the brain, eventually culminating in as many as 40 to 100 billion neurons in the newborn baby. Each of these neurons joins with thousands of other neurons at synaptic crossroads, creating extraordinary complex neural circuits throughout the brain. With as many as 100 trillion of these interconnections, some scientists theorize that the human brain may be one of the most complex structures in the known universe. It is this neural circuitry that lays the foundation for healthy or unhealthy functioning. Problems occur when that neural circuitry is interrupted, just like problems would occur if the electric circuitry in your house was malfunctioning. To function and survive, the brain, like all living systems, requires integration with all of its billions of subsystems working in absolute, precise cooperation with each other.
Our brains allow us to perceive and interact with the world around us. This 3-pound mass of tissue contains nearly 40 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses or connections, sending information to the rest of our body at a rate of nearly 500 messages per second. Science tells us that early brain development affects the course of our later lives. Years of accumulated research on how the brain develops and functions now informs best practices in the nurturing of children. But there remains a disconnect between this science and what is practiced in communities. The gap between knowledge and practice has huge consequences for society.
If we look at the cost of healthcare, the achievement gap, look at crime, the problems that we face in society today, science tells us that we actually know the root of these problems. Many of these problems actually go back to early childhood.
I get a lot of referrals from school for behavioral problems. A lot of times teachers refer kids due to acting out behaviors, attentional problems, learning problems. Although we call them school-related behaviors, lots of times they've developed years and years before. They just start showing when children enter school.
We all know that some children get to school much more capable of learning than others, and that how they arrive at school will influence how they do for the rest of their academic careers. So one way to think about the development of brain architecture in early childhood is it's a lot like building a house.
And as when building a house, the developing brain requires a sturdy foundation. A proper brain foundation needs responsive and nurturing adults.
Our brains definitely need stimulation to be able to wire the brain up correctly. Left in a crib, a child cannot provide the stimulation its brain needs to form a healthy and solid brain architecture.
Responsive parenting is key to a process called pruning. Pruning is how the brain creates the most efficient pathways possible. During the first year of life, there are periods of growth where nearly 700 synapses are formed a second, creating connections for language, hearing, vision, and movement. However, not all these connections are needed or are efficient. Pruning back the pathways that are rarely used allows the brain to send signals more quickly. These pathways are the foundation for later learning, forming our brain architecture. Babies' brains grow by building themselves from the bottom up.
So you're sculpting the brain by the information that the brain is processing.
By the age of 2, our brains have already made some giant developmental leaps. Regions of the brain that control vision and hearing have already developed. Areas that handle language and communication skills, which are heavily dependent upon interaction with adults, are rapidly developing. And the part of our brain that deals with higher-order reasoning and cognitive functions is at its crucial beginning phase of development. Sadly, many children do not receive the attention they need to form healthy brain architecture.
By age 2, we can already predict third-grade reading scores. So many of the things that we think are happening later in life are actually have their beginnings in early childhood and infancy.
The ability to predict third-grade reading skills at age 2 has to do with understanding brain architecture. The part of the brain that controls language and communication has its largest growth spurt during a child's first 4 years. Without a responsive adult at this age, the pruning process begins to disconnect underused pathways. This leads to language and reading difficulties later.
The brain doesn't work in pieces. It works as a coherent whole. So if the foundation isn't set well, it sends poor information to those higher centers. And what starts looking like a problem in this part of the brain ends up being a problem in attention regulation and higher order cognition. So brain architecture is not set by 2 years of age. There's still a lot happening. But what happens early influences what happens later. Skill begets skill.
Research shows that children who have had positive adult interaction, adequate nutrition, and minimal exposure to stress arrive at school better able to learn than those who have grown up with those factors. What adults can do to help a child's developing brain reach its full potential will be covered in the video Serve and Return.
So it is especially in those early embryonic stages that brain development affects the course of our later lives, with prenatal and perinatal periods perhaps the most consequential, as the brain is in the process of developing its delicate, complex neurocircuitry. I would highly recommend that you not only see this video again, but the one called Serve and Return. They're created by the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. And I wish that all parents would have an opportunity to see both of these, all parents to see these wonderful videos. So this next slide is from the thinking of Daniel Siegel. He likes to say the brain is enskulled, that is, it's encased within our bony cranium, that it's embodied, that in other words, the brain interacts with every part of our body, all our organs, tissues, et cetera, right down to the cellular level, and that the brain is interrelational. And that's really the essence of the neurological relationships. Our brains are shaped by our experiences because the brain is neuroplastic. We become a part of the patterns we weave. I would like to review with you a brief history of neuroplasticity, of the discovery of neuroplasticity, which is one of the most revolutionary discoveries of the 20th century. We begin with these 4 men who played critical roles in the discovery of neurogenesis, or that is the production of new neurons in the brain. These are not necessarily household names, but each of these men played prominent roles in the understanding of the brain-environment connection. The first one is Kurt Levine. I recall in general psychology, we were admonished not to say Kurt Lewin, but because it should be pronounced Kurt Levine. He was a German-American psychologist, often regarded as the father of social psychology. And he spent time at a number of universities, including Stanford, Cornell, University of Iowa, and finally MIT. He suggested that neither nature nor nurture alone can account for individuals' behaviors and personalities, but rather that both nature and nurture interact to shape each person. This idea was presented in the form of Levine's equation for behavior. B, which is behavior, is a function of personal characteristics in interacting with the environment. So behavior is a function of the person interacting with his or her environment. Some years later, R Bronfenbrenner who is considered to be the founder of ecological systems theory, again said the environment you grow up in affects every facet of your life. He was a Russian-born developmental psychologist, and he formulated a theory of human development based on intricate ecological web of human relationships. Interestingly, his work was premised on the thinking of his predecessor, Kurt Levine. He expanded on Levine's theory by describing the myriad of societal layers in which the interplay between the person and the environment takes place, and the larger context in which those settings are embedded. He portrayed the ecological environment much like Russian dolls, with each doll nested in the next larger doll. At the deepest level of Bronfenbrenner's theory is the microsystem, the one-on-one connection between the mother and the child that serves as the critical foundation for the child's brain development. Extending beyond this dyad are sequentially larger macro system influences. For example, the family, the extended family, the school, community, and a host of other societal factors such as the economy, politics, technology, and the cultural, moral, and political climate of the time, sometimes referred to as the zeitgeist. Bronfenbrenner observed that more than any other species, humans are largely responsible for creating the environments that shape their own human development. In other words, human beings are both garden and gardener. His bioecological theory is premised on the idea that public policy needs to provide the optimal ecological conditions for producing healthy human beings. According to his theory, the family is the most critical nucleus of the ecological model, in which the child receives the enduring and loving care from his or her parents or caretakers. He referred to the family as the center of gravity of the biopsychosocial person, emphasizing that the success of the family can either be enhanced or degraded by policies and practices of the larger systems within society, the so-called macro system. This concern led to his formulation of two simple principles with profound implications for making human beings fully human. At the micro level, children need the enduring and loving care of one or more adults. At the macro level, public policy and practices need to strengthen the status of parenthood and families. How are we doing in both these micro and macro levels? Does society in general support the family? These are important questions. Our next influence is Joseph Altman, not exactly as famous as a rock star, but he played a crucial role in the discovery of neuroplasticity. Born in Hungary to a Jewish family, he survived the Holocaust and migrated with his family via Germany and Australia to the United States. In these places, he always sought employment as a librarian because he wanted to have the freedom to inform himself by reading books about psychology, human behavior, and especially the structure of the human brain. He earned his PhD in 1959 from NYU and did a postdoctoral fellowship at Columbia University, and then eventually sought a position at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. It was in 1962, using a newly discovered stain that could differentiate between old neurons and new neurons, Altman discovered neurogenesis, that is the creation of new neurons in the adult brains of rats. This was a revolutionary finding because prior to that, the dogma was that once the child was born, there was no change in the brain whatsoever. This was a dogma that was promoted by San Diego Ramon y Cajal, who said in adult centers, the nerve paths are somewhat fixed, ended, immutable. Everything may die, nothing may be regenerated. So this idea that the brain was fixed and immutable was the dogma of the time. And it was supported by another famous neuroscientist who was at the Yale School of Medicine. The work that Altman had done did not get the attention that it needed. As a matter of fact, he didn't even get tenure, and he transferred to Purdue University. So it shows you that even in research and science, there can be politics and power that play an important role. Our next important neuroscientist is known as Fred Rusty Gage, who was at the time working for the Salk Institute for the Biological Studies. The beauty of science is that rarely is the research a one and done deal. Rather, it's often a persistent dialogue that takes place over time, with each new study shedding more light on the matter at hand. That was clearly the case with neurogenesis. Altman had opened the door, but it took more than 30 years before proof of neurogenesis made its way up the phylogenetic scale from mice to rats to birds to primates and finally to Homo sapiens. For example, Fernando Nottebohm from Rockefeller University discovered the presence of new neurons in songbirds. He realized, he paid a lot of attention to songbirds and noticed that certain canaries were singing different tunes at different times of different years. And so that's what encouraged him to do the research. And then Elizabeth Gould in the 1960s, a distinguished professor of neuroscience at Princeton, who was, was in the 1990s. She was born coincidentally in 1962, the same year that Altman discovered neurogenesis in rats. It was in the early 1990s that she discovered the presence of new neurons in primates, namely monkeys. So here we go up the phylogenetic scale. So, but what about humans? Well, there was a practical problem. That is, there was no non-invasive way to detect the growth of new neurons without having the ability to dissect a person's brains. So, of course, that would be a bit of an ethical problem. So Gage teamed up with the Swedish neurologist Peter Eriksson, and they worked with oncologists around the world to identify families of patients who had died of brain cancer and sought permission to allow their loved ones' brains to be autopsied for the benefit of science. The cancer specialist used a new stain called BRDU, B-R-D-U, which is initials for a much longer scientific name, commonly used to study cell proliferation in living tissues, to identify the presence of newly grown cancer cells. Gage and Eriksson sort of hypothesized if they could be used to identify new cancer cells, could they also identify new healthy cells? And the answer was yes. The postmortem examination of the brains of these subjects revealed that new healthy neurons were present along with the new cancer cells. And good news for us senior citizens, some of those neurons in Gage's experiments were found in patients that were in their 50s and 70s. This was the first evidence of neuroplasticity that occurred between 1996 and 1998 in humans. Gage reported this finding to the Dalai Lama, who at the time was operating a organization called the Mind and Life organization that had been studying for many years the brain and human behavior. And it was at a meeting of the Mind and Life organization that Fred Gage told His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the environment and our experiences change the brain. So who you are as a person changes by virtue of the environment you live in and the experiences you have. Experience-dependent neuroplasticity. I just wanted to sort of also mention Sharon Begley, who unfortunately passed away last year. She was a very gifted writer, science writer for Newsweek magazine. And this book called Train Your Mind, Change Your Brain does outline a number of the scientific experiences that I just mentioned. And what's really important, I think, is the way she closes this book, saying, as the discoveries of neuroplasticity and self-directed neuroplasticity trickle down to clinics and schools and plain old living rooms, the ability to willfully change the brain will become a central part of our lives and of our understanding about what it means to be human. What she was getting at there is that we are not just subject to our environments from the outside environments, but that we also have the capacity to change our own minds, and through techniques like mindfulness and meditation. And there's a long history that goes back 1,000 years to suggest that this is the case, with many scientific research projects supporting that to be the case. So let's just take a look, knowing what we know now about the brain-environment connection, to see what we were dealing with in our society. So here's an article that was in the Hartford Current just a few weeks ago. 42% of the state's children face poverty. 4 in 10 Connecticut children live in households facing financial hardships. 72% of Black children, 67% of Hispanic children, 26% of white children, and 25% of Asian children. So you might sort of consider what are the implications for this early development when poverty is so much a part of the children's lives. And we have come to realize that poverty is one of the adverse childhood experiences that exist. Now, if we could just reduce some poverty, we find out that just a short period of time, it has sort of miraculous benefits for the brain. This article was in the New York Times in January 2022. And it had to do right around the same time that President Biden was offering tax benefits, child tax benefits for poor families, virtually almost overnight, reducing childhood poverty by 50%. And the research during this period suggested that electroencephalograms, EEGs, when they evaluated the children at age 1, they showed that the ones that were in the high cash group had better brain activity compared to those who were in the low cash group. In other words, the baby's brain's activity was associated with a stronger cognitive development when they received the tax credits. This is really important research. Here's another sort of a picture of what happens with moms who smoke. They found the study that was done examined newborn and infant deaths from 2008 to 2018 in 159 countries and concluded that an estimated 231,220 infant deaths, including 181,970 newborn deaths, might have been prevented if all the countries in the study had a cigarette tax rate of 75%. This was reported in the Hartford Current on March 24th, 2022. We're all familiar at this point with Rochelle Walensky, the lovely director of the Center for Disease Control. And she pointed out that racism is one of the variables that they study and concluded that it's a serious public health threat that directly affects the well-being of millions of Americans, and as a result, the health of our entire nation. Racism is at the root cause of many health disparities that overwhelmingly impact so many of the communities in which we live. So here's another picture of the seeds that we sow. There's so many things that are going against the healthy environmental influences on the brain. Abuse and neglect, as we know from the ACEs study, being one of the most important. There's so many other things. For example, Atlantic Magazine talked about how America has an alcohol problem. They said from 1999 to 2017, the number of alcohol-related deaths in the U.S. doubled for more than 70,000 a year, making alcohol one of the leading drivers of the decline in American life expectancy. Another research project that was done on harsh fathers found, that was reported in the Journal of Adolescence, found that the presence of harsh fathers in a child's life may be worse than the absence of the father altogether. Results of the study found that youth in the harsh father group engaged in more delinquent behavior and used more substances than the youth in the absent father group. Another study found that when the fathers tended to be authoritarian in their discipline style, that was associated with the risk of engaging with their children engaging in delinquent activity and substance abuse. So this is a sort of a slide that shows you the 10 adverse childhood experiences that were studied by the Center for Disease Control with the Kaiser Permanente Health Maintenance Organization in the 1990s. They administer the adverse childhood experience tests to over 17,000 health maintenance organization members, and found that there was a high incidence of people who reported having experienced physical, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, physical neglect, etc., within their childhoods. And they found that these experiences were associated with the occurrence of not only emotional conditions like depression, suicide, etc., but also physical, the four major physical conditions, that is heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and obstructive pulmonary disease. So what they found was really quite astonishing, that the ACEs were found to have a graded dose response relationship, which means that the more ACEs a person had, the more likely that the chances that they would have the experiences of health and both physical and emotional disabilities. More than half of the general population experiences at least one ACE. Over 25% experience 2 or more ACEs, and 1 in 8 people experience 4 or more ACEs. I had a student in one of my classes who worked for the Department of Children and Family Services, and he said, "Dr. Malley, my children have 7 or 8 of these ACEs." The social and financial strain on society is just extraordinary when you consider that the damage that these early childhood experiences have on our children. And these are the seeds that we sow. By the way, I'd like to recommend 2 books if you're interested in exploring more about ACEs. The one is called The Deepest Well, which is by Nadine Burke Harris. a phenomenal pediatrician. And the other one is more recently published, I think continues to be on the New York Times bestseller list, called What Happened to You, by the neuroscientist Bruce Perry, along with Oprah Winfrey. So in addition to these ACEs, someone asked the question, well, what would it be like if you were dealing with an urban community? And research was done. There was research called the Philadelphia Urban Study, and found out that where there are adverse community environments, such as poverty, racism, poor housing, lack of opportunity, community disruption, and violence, that the residuals are even worse. The first study that was created by the Kaiser Permanente and CDC found that 69% had at least one ACE. But the Philadelphia ACE project found that 83% of participants had at least one ACE. So it got sequentially worse and worse. So I've covered a lot of territory here for you, much to think about. And, you know, it occurs to me that someone might think that, well, goodness, what does this all have to do with free will and human agency? And I just happened to be rereading this phenomenal book called Man's Search for Meaning, considered to be one of the most, 1 out of 10 most important books ever written by Viktor Frankl, that chronicles his experiences in a Nazi death camp during World War II. And he wondered about this too. Is it possible that we are inescapably a product of our environment and experiences? So he concluded, based on his own experience, that everything can be taken from human beings except for the last of human freedom, to choose one's attitude in a given set of circumstances. Humans can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in the terrible conditions of a concentration camp. It is this spiritual freedom which cannot be taken away that makes life meaningful and purposeful. And then another thought that occurred to me as I was reading Frankl's book is that the Center for Disease Control says that the best remedy for dealing with childhood trauma is for them to have safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. They refer to them as SSNRS. So to be safe, to be free from physical or psychological harm, to have stability in one's life, that is predictability and consistency of one's relationships and social and physical environments, that you're not only safe, but you can count on being safe over a period of time. And then lastly, nurturing, the process of caring for and encouraging the growth of someone. So it occurred to me that if you look at these three variables and you think about someone whose desire it is to keep their children safe, to keep them free from fear of physical or psychological harm, and not only in the moment, but also over a period of time, so that the child knows that things are predictable and that they'll be safe over a period of time. And then lastly, these people really care deeply for the person, and they really care about their growth. And again, sort of it brought me back to things that Viktor Frankl was saying, is to me, these are sort of operational definitions for what love is. When you want somebody to be safe, stable, and you are nurturing them, then this is really love, isn't it? And this is what Viktor Frankl concluded his book with, that the salvation of humanity is through love and in love. And so when we think about that video with the early brain developing from the Center for the Developing Child, this is really what we need to do, in the microcosm and in the macrocosm to make sure that love is what conquers all. And that concludes my presentation for now. I hope to be with you again soon. Thank you very much.